Hey, hello, everybody. I'm delighted to introduce Hannah Servedio, who I heard speak a couple years ago at a NARAL pro-choice event, and I was very delighted to hear her speak. She's a great speaker, very knowledgeable. And as Nora was saying before, it is very timely. Her speech is very timely, given what happened with the Supreme Court in Texas this week. Hannah is the senior field organizer for NARAL Pro-Choice Ohio, and she comes to NARAL with a myriad of nonprofit experience, most recently working in the domestic and sexual violence fields. She is skilled in many facets of advocacy work, including educational programming, volunteer management, training facilitation, and community mobilization and engagement. Hannah is also an enthusiastic volunteer and volunteers as a lead escort with the Northeast Ohio Abortion Clinic, a CASA GAL with Summit County Juvenile Court, and an active participant in a variety of additional causes she feels passionate about. Hannah is a graduate of Kent State University and will talk to us tonight about the fight for reproductive rights in Ohio. And so I would like to give the floor to Hannah.
Like Karen said, my name is Hannah Servedio. I am the senior organizer for NARAL Prochoice Ohio. I am super grateful for this invite and really happy to be here tonight to give an overview of reproductive rights in Ohio and kind of the things that NARAL focuses on, important pieces of legislation, and how you can get involved if you're so interested in doing so. This will be a 101 overview because, we don't have a ton of time with this presentation. And so if there's anything in particular that I've talked about that you're interested in us going more in depth about, or connecting you to an organization that might focus a little bit more specifically on said issue, I'm happy to make those connections or come back and do this again. So I just kind of want to start off by giving a brief overview of who NARAL is and the work that we do. So we are definitely not in this work alone. We are a statewide organization that works on a myriad of different issues related to reproductive rights, but this work is definitely not done in a silo, and we are super grateful for all of our partners that we do this work with. When I end the presentation and talk a little bit about ways in which you can get involved, I'm happy to name some of those partners and help get people connected in the area that feels right for them. So we were founded in 1979 as a 501c4 nonprofit pro-choice membership and lobbying organization. We do monitoring, analyzing, and lobbying for or against legislative proposals relevant to the protection of reproductive choice, provide written and verbal testimony to legislative committees, and basically NARAL serves as community voice at the state and local level when it comes to legislation. We do a ton of grassroots organizing. That is kind of my area as the senior organizer. Our strength is obviously in our numbers, and our goal is to meet people where they are and use their voices and stories to build community power. By continually building the collective voice of our membership, we increase our impact on state politics, gain pro-choice support, and make sustainable change. We also are involved in electoral activity, so we recruit pro-choice volunteers, train them, and turn out the vote for pro-choice candidates. We also employ NARAL Pro-Choice Ohio Foundation, which is our sister 501c3 organization that provides public education to support the NARAL Pro-Choice Ohio mission. Thirdly, we have a PAC, our statewide pro-choice political action committee that provides direct support to candidates. So those are the three different realms we work on as NARAL. We have offices in Cleveland and Columbus, a staff of 12 now, I think. We just had some kind of turnover with some of our staff, but we're all over the state and we're doing a lot of different things. Just a quick note, I know that folks that have been following this movement for a while have probably been familiar with NARAL Pro-Choice America, who is our national level affiliate. We are a state affiliate of NARAL America. NARAL comes from, the name NARAL comes from a lot of different abbreviations. Actually, it used to be the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, the National Abortion Rights Action League, At this point, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, it means something, but the abbreviation doesn't mean anything. It's just NARAL. And while NARAL America is focused on federal level laws and federal level government, we are focused entirely on Ohio legislators, Ohio legislation, Ohio communities, that sort of thing. So let's dive into talking about the issues that we focus on. Now, if people want to put questions in the chat, if they have them throughout this, I can address them at the end. We'll have a Q&A kind of portion is what Karen said. So I'm happy to go back and answer any questions that folks have if you want to write them down or note them in the chat or anything like that. So we focus on a couple of different issues that are within the spectrum of reproductive rights and health. Most specifically and largely, we focus on accessing abortion and legislative restrictions on that care. We are an abortion out loud organization. We do not shy away from the conversation. We don't, couch the word in other very beautiful ways of phrasing reproductive rights. We are an abortion rights organization and are very proud of that. But we also do work in intersecting issues like birth control, emergency contraceptives, sex education, crisis pregnancy centers, and paid family leave. And so what I will do next is kind of go through all of these issues one by one and things that are important to know about them in Ohio. All right, so let's start with abortion restrictions and the obstacles that are currently in place for people looking to access care. So in Ohio, we have 9 clinics currently, 6 that provide both medical and in-clinic abortion care, and 3 that provide medication only at this time. In this part of the state, we have Preterm in Cleveland, Planned Parenthood in Bedford Heights, Northeast Ohio Women's Center in Cuyahoga Falls, and in Shaker Heights. The Shaker Heights one is a medication-only clinic. Clinics are most normally either Planned Parenthoods or independent clinics. And actually 2/3 of the abortions that are done in this country are done by independent clinics. We have plenty of Planned Parenthoods in the state that exist as just health centers and don't do abortions. And then we also have Planned Parenthood health centers that do abortions. It's important to note that this is less than half of the amount of clinics that existed in Ohio 10 years ago. And we can thank John Kasich for that. But we'll talk more about legislation in just a bit. Clinics that exist in Ohio must have a transfer agreement with a local private hospital. The hospital cannot be public, including university affiliated, nor religious, and it must be within 30 miles from the clinic. Nothing requires hospitals to enter into such an agreement, nor are exceptions made for rural areas. Clinics can apply to the Ohio Department of Health if unable to get one, but the Ohio Department of Health has not always been favorable to our cause. If a person under the age of 18 wants to obtain an abortion, they need to have parental or guardian consent. If they cannot get that, then they can appeal to a county judge for a judicial bypass in the county where they live or an adjacent county. In these cases, the judges are often weighing on opinions of maturity, as in, is the youth mature enough to be able to make the decision for them to get an abortion, which is a very odd concept to me, considering that the latter would be the young folk having a child. So the maturity is the question there for the judge. With regards to the actual appointment, Ohio has a 24-hour waiting period in place, aka a person cannot get an abortion on the day of their first appointment. They must wait at least 24 hours for a second appointment to do so. During the first appointment, the doctor is required to do an ultrasound and is required to offer the patient the opportunity to see it. They're not forced to see it, but the doctor is required to offer the patient the opportunity to see it. The provider is required to give the patient state-directed materials designed to discourage a person from getting an abortion. And then as far as limits go, Ohio is a state where a provider cannot perform an abortion past 19 weeks of pregnancy or 21 weeks and 6 days from a person's last menstrual period, unless that person's life is in danger. Not all clinics in the state go up to that limit though, some are less. And I will note that the rules and the laws look different throughout the country. There are states that are a lot more, open and supportive of abortion rights. There are some states that are pretty similarly restrictive, and then there are a lot of states that are places in the middle. Some people have longer waiting periods. Some people have no waiting periods. And so this is just kind of specifically what it looks like for Ohio. As far as paying for an abortion goes, since 1977, the federally mandated Hyde Amendment has prevented any federal funds from going to abortion care, with rape, incest, and life of mother exceptions. AKA Medicaid can't be used for abortions on average. In Ohio, insurance plans for state employees prohibit abortion care, as do health insurance policies offered in the state insurance exchange. Some private insurances, however, do cover abortion care, like the one that I get through NARAL. It's very important to us that we have insurance coverage that covers abortion care. So all of those different areas of restrictions were laws and regulations that have been passed in Ohio over the last however many years. And then we have what we are fighting now, which is laws that are just increasing in the reach that they are trying to kind of have over people and their access to abortion care. Some of the previous laws were challenged and failed. Others were not challenged due to perceived constitutional nature of them. There are several bills, however, that have passed and were signed recently in Ohio, but are not in effect due to challenges and court proceedings. These are really important to know because there's a lot of media coverage of these abortion bills. And if one, newspaper's headline is, it says it in a particular way, people will take that and they will run with it. And so it's really important to kind of correct the narrative of what is in effect and what is not. So recently passed and signed is Senate Bill 27. That was requiring fetal tissue to be cremated or buried after an abortion, an option that is already given to patients after an abortion, but making it a requirement, either at the expense of the patient or of the clinic if the patient declines. This piece of legislation is currently under a preliminary injunction as the Ohio Department of Health drafts code rules for the law. So it is not in effect and has additional opportunities for challenges ahead. Senate Bill 260 would ban telemedicine counseling for medical abortion care. That would be that first appointment. It's a method that Planned Parenthoods in the state were employing for a little bit of time. This is also currently under a preliminary injunction while the trial continues. The most notable bill, though, probably is Senate Bill 23, which was the 6-week abortion ban. That was signed in 2019. It is currently blocked by a federal judge from going into an effect, though this is temporary. A stay extending this blockage was issued in March of this year. So the 6-week ban, the heartbeat bill, as it was called, but not how we refer to it, is a bill that is very much not in effect in Ohio. There are also a number of bills that we're watching in this upcoming, in this General Assembly, so things that are upcoming or just being paid attention to by us. One is the budget process. We will definitely talk about that a little bit later in the presentation as it relates to specific issues. We are watching House Bill 249, which is the Crisis Pregnancy Center tax credit bill. I'll talk a little bit later about what crisis pregnancy centers are, if they're something that you're not familiar with. But it's basically authorizing a non-refundable income tax credit for contributions specifically to organizations that do not perform or promote abortions or contract with a person that does. This is largely to benefit crisis pregnancy centers. It was introduced in a previous session, and it was more specifically marketed then as a CPC bill. The language of this bill is a little bit more vague, but it's a very similar bill overall. We're watching Senate Bill 123, which is a trigger ban bill. Now, a trigger ban is very related to what's happening in SCOTUS, which we'll touch on a little bit later, the Supreme Court, and the potential overturning or gutting of Roe v. Wade. There are many states throughout the country that either have a partial or full trigger ban in effect, and that essentially means that the bill is contingent on what's happening with a federal level precedent. So if Roe were to fall or to be gutted in such a way that it could affect, like everything could go back to the states, then this bill could immediately be put into effect if it were to be passed and signed. And this bill bans all abortions with a exception for life of the mother, but that is it. House Bill 157 penalizes doctors who do not provide medical care to fetuses who survive an abortion procedure. This is a really complicated piece of legislation, and I will just note that this is something that there are already multiple laws in place to prevent any sort of malpractice around. So it's really just kind of doubling down on stigmatization of abortion procedures. I will also note, before I move on to talking a little bit about birth control and emergency contraceptives, that a lot of times when we talk about these bills, we use language of, extreme, like the trigger ban is the most extreme bill we've ever seen. It is definitely a bill that pushes to the limit conversations around abortion access. It pushes restrictions further than we've ever seen it go before. But we want to be really careful when we use kind of more alarmist language like that, in that we don't want anybody to think that lesser bills or bills that do less are less extreme in practice, right? Because some of these restrictions are very much preventing people from getting abortions, just in the same way that some of these other bills would do. So they are all very bad, very extreme bills. Any bill that criminalizes abortion or prevents access to abortion is an extreme bill. Okay. Let's talk about birth control and emergency contraceptives. So these are some of the other issues that NARAL focuses on. We focus on them in a number of different ways. Sometimes we are partnered with other organizations that focus on them more mainly. Other times we're supporting pieces of legislation. But these are things that kind of ebb and flow in terms of our priorities. Abortion usually sits kind of at the top because it's one of the things that's the most under attack. As far as birth control goes in Ohio, current law is silent on minors accessing birth control. So it neither explicitly forbids nor necessarily promotes it. Therefore, in most reproductive health clinics, a minor is able to receive birth control without parental consent, which is awesome. But it's important to note that insurance is not silent. So if a young person is still on their parents' insurance, there's a good chance that the explanation of benefits will list out why they went to the doctor, from STD tests to birth control and things like that. I had that experience in college, and I had to have a nice long conversation with my father about an explanation of benefits. So just something for young folks to keep in mind if they are looking into clinics and using their insurance in this way. I just want to briefly touch on the Title X Family Program. The Title X Family Planning Program is a federal grant program that was created in 1970 to provide comprehensive and confidential family planning services and preventative health services. It's administered by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, their Office of Population Affairs. It's basically a program that prioritizes serving people and families with low incomes and is implemented through grants to over 3,500 clinical sites throughout the United States. So Ohio has a number of these clinics, though there have been some over the last few years that have either lost funding or voluntarily pulled themselves from the Title X program because of the gag rule. So the domestic gag rule was put into place by Trump in 2019, and it basically said that any organizations that have this funding cannot refer to or provide abortion care. And so several Planned Parenthoods in Ohio left the Title X funding program and things like that. And that definitely had an effect on the Title X clinics in Ohio. The gag rule is still in effect as of now, which I actually didn't know until I looked a little bit more deeply into it. It's something that Biden has been saying since he got into office, that he has indicated his support for repealing it. But as of now, in mid-May of 2021, the domestic gag rule is still in effect. I also want to note at the end of this paragraph, I have a little note. The end of this slide, excuse me, I have a little note about emergency contraceptives. The statement is actually slightly misleading. My apologies. I had two documents up when I was making this, and I sort of combined my two in intended statements with an old rule. I had one that had an old date on it. So this age specification that I noted on here is not correct. It used to be in effect, but it is no longer. It is correct that there is emergency contraceptives available over the counter that you don't need a prescription for, especially if you are paying cash. This is regardless of age. There are also other versions of the pill that do need a prescription. Where it gets a little tricky is that some insurance companies, if using insurance, require a prescription, and others don't. So it's important that if you are somebody who is using insurance for this, to call your insurance company and kind of talk about coverage and what that looks like. As a reminder, if anybody has questions throughout this, you can feel free to put them in the chat. And I will certainly try my best to address them at the end. I am not a lawyer nor a medical professional, but I do work in those spaces, so I will do the best that I can to answer anything that might come up. All right, let's talk about sex education. This is one of my favorite topics, and I wish that Ohio was more favorable to comprehensive sex education, because I think that it is so important for students to have that basis. Before I worked for NARAL, I worked for the Domestic Violence and Rape Crisis Center in Summit County, and I was very involved in going into the schools and teaching rape crisis programming to students. And that was just an incredible experience for me, and it really taught me a lot in terms of how young folks think and what they need, and that really helps me in my organizing role now. And so I really wish that there were more conversations happening around sex ed. About 20 years ago, there were conservative state lawmakers that returned a federal grant to pay for sex education in the K through 12 system and installed a legal requirement that any statewide health standards would have to be approved by the Ohio legislature. As of now, Ohio is the only state in the entire nation without health education standards to offer guidance on what children should learn about a number of different things. So we have no health education standards, including no standards for sex education in public schools. Currently, the Board of Education of each school district must establish a health curriculum for all schools under their control, which includes information on HIV and sexually transmitted infections, but that basically leaves it up to each individual school district. So all students are getting very different exposure to sex education. There are some districts that provide really comprehensive instruction. Dublin City Schools over on the other side of Ohio is one such district. On the other hand, Hudson, which is pretty close to us over here in Cleveland, a little bit more south, is one that I personally had an experience with when I was teaching the rape crisis programming, and found it really frustrating that, you know, parents were allowed to exempt students from any conversations, not only regarding sex education, but also about sexual violence prevention. They were allowed to tell their children that they couldn't participate in those conversations. So students are growing up in Ohio having a number of different experiences with this conversation. In Ohio, it is required to teach sex education, but as it relates to, or as it specifically is kind of stated in our state rules, the Ohio school curriculum for sex education is not required to be comprehensive. It must emphasize abstinence. It's not required to include instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity. It's not required to include instruction on consent. And then parents or guardians can exempt their student from an opt-out policy from receiving any or all sex education instruction. Ohio also, with this lack of standards, has no standard regarding medically accurate sex education. And this is when some of these more conservative abstinence-based programs go into the schools, that gives them a little bit more freedom with what they teach to the students. There's been a couple legislative, bills that have been proposed from both angles of this to try to mitigate this. House Bill 90, which failed last session, was a horrible piece of legislation that was introduced by a particularly conservative lawmaker that wanted to require the State Board of Education to develop a program regarding the humanity of the unborn child. And then the instruction would be able to be implemented in schools. There was Senate Bill 121, which also failed last session. It sought to allow each school district to develop its own standards and curriculum for venereal disease education, but maintained an emphasis on abstinence. It sought to require the State Board of Education to develop health education standards, and that bill did not go anywhere either. This session, two bills that you can keep your eye on, or one more positive, one negative, is House Bill 105. This is to amend sections of the Ohio Revised Code with respect to age-appropriate student instruction in child sexual abuse and sexual violence prevention, and in-service staff training for child sexual abuse prevention. And then there's House Bill 240, which is kind of the other side of the spectrum, to amend some sections of the revised code to enact the Parent Right to Know Act, which aims to require school districts to provide written notice and receive parental consent prior to providing any additional sex education outside of the required topics. So there's a lot of room for bipartisanship here on this issue, and we see that sometimes in some of these bills that are around sexual abuse prevention and things like that. Even when the two sides of the spectrum can't get on the same page with actually teaching like medically accurate sex education, some of the more intersecting issues there is some wiggle room kind of in the middle for, and I'd love to see some progress made on this. Looks like there is comments in the chat. I'll take a look at that when we are at the end. Thank you for those questions, Spike. Okay. All right, let's talk about CPCs. Are from like some nods. Are people familiar with CPCs, crisis pregnancy centers? No, I'm seeing mostly no's, a couple thumbs up, a couple yeses. Okay. So crisis pregnancy centers, if it's not something that you're familiar with, it's a rather intense kind of concept. It is a nonprofit organization that is established purely to persuade pregnant people against having an abortion. CPCs generally provide peer counseling related to abortion, pregnancy, and childbirth. They may also offer additional non-medical services like financial assistance or child rearing resources, and adoption referrals. Crisis pregnancy centers frequently market themselves as full-service medical clinics and promise to provide free pregnancy tests, ultrasounds, comprehensive counseling on pregnancy-related options. But in the reality, most crisis pregnancy centers do not have medical facility licensing. They offer limited medical and social services and present pregnant people with two options: parenthood or adoption. Because CPCs are generally lack medical licenses and offer their services free of charge, they are often exempt from HIPAA or like the state regulations governing medical ethics. In addition, although some staff at CPCs dress in scrubs or white coats to seem like that they are medical providers, they're typically volunteers without formal medical training who may fail to disclose if the CPC is not a licensed medical facility or not. These CPCs use phony ads to trick pregnant people into making an appointment, often promising free ultrasounds or pregnancy support. And once they're inside, people are lied to and shamed and pressured about their reproductive health decisions. Sometimes this even delays their procedure or pushes them past the deadline for a legal abortion. So they're stuck. How are they legal, you might ask? Fake clinics are considered religious outreach. They are set up as religious nonprofits, and these programs are protected by the First Amendment. So they exist. They exist in the hundreds. Close to 3,000 fake health centers across the country exist, while there are only actually 800 abortion providers. In Ohio, there are 9 clinics that provide abortion care, and there are over 100 CPCs. Note, especially located in the bigger cities types of area, there are a number of them in Northeast Ohio surrounding Cleveland. So in Ohio, CPCs actually receive state funding, which is an incredibly frustrating reality. It is through money taken from the TAMF grant, or the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. The last fiscal year, or the last fiscal budget, it was to the tune of 3.75 million a year, so 7.5 million total. They're asking for even more this year through this budget negotiation. This money is allocated to the Ohio Parenting and Pregnancy Program. It was created to provide services for pregnant people and parents or other relatives caring for children, to promote childbirth, parenting, and alternatives to abortion. So the state funds this program. This program distributes money to CPCs, and CPCs lie and shame patients. So they are asking for more money for that in the budget cycle this year. I'm also very aware, I just want to note that this is a rather depressing presentation. There is not a lot of positives that are happening in Ohio, but a big positive is that we are all together talking about this. I know that it seems maybe not as important in the reality of what we're up against, but having these conversations, and then the 30 people on this call taking these conversations and distributing them to 30 more people is more people than we were able to reach in the beginning. So I know it's depressing and anger inducing, and it is for me as well. But I'm glad that we're having this conversation. And then briefly kind of touching on paid family leave. Just one second. So folks might be familiar with the Family and Medical Leave Act, passed in 1993. It is a federal law that requires all public agencies, public and private elementary and secondary schools, and companies with 50 or more employees to provide up to 12 weeks of leave per year to eligible employees for the birth of a child, a health condition, or the care of a family member with a serious health condition. The leave required by federal law is unpaid, and it only applies to larger employers. So a lot of people are often left out from this benefit. Congress, when they passed it, provided that states may pass their own leave laws that are more generous than what's required by the federal statute if they so prefer to do that. You may not be surprised, but Ohio is not one of them. There was a bill that was last General Assembly session, that aimed to establish a family and medical leave insurance benefit. It didn't make it past being introduced in committee, but there are, very progressive members of the General Assembly, and have been in the past, that are really pushing for this type of work. And so I urge you to support them. I want to say that we don't do much in this capacity as NARAL, but support anytime that we're able to, offer legislation assistance or testimony and things like that. I would urge you all to follow the Women's Public Policy Network in Ohio and Policy Matters Ohio. Both of them have do a lot of work around paid family leave in Ohio, or the fight for it. So I want to also touch on the SCOTUS case. I know that this is something that people are very worked up about, and rightfully so. This is a scary thing to have happen. The SCOTUS case, the Supreme Court case that they're taking up is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. And they are considering the legality of Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban. I want to note that it isn't immediate. The SCOTUS will hear arguments in fall, winter of 2021, and a decision will be released in spring or summer 2022. So this is not something we're up against immediately, but it's definitely something that is coming soon, and to keep in mind, especially with these trigger bans and other sorts of things happening on a state level. The fact that as I am not a lawyer, I am not going to make any sort of predictions as to what could happen or reasons why they took this case up. There's a lot of people that don't know, but the taking up of this case indicates at least a willingness to revisit existing precedent. So that could be good, and that could also be very bad, depending on the makeup of the court and what it is that they decide. Karen had also asked me to talk a little bit about the Texas ban. Now, I'll be honest, there's so much to keep up with in Ohio that I don't often find myself really delving deep into the laws that other states are working on, unless they are similar to laws that we've passed. But I did see this one, and I saw that it was a pretty, public and part of the conversation a lot. And so I wanted to look into it. So a couple of days ago, Texas signed a 6-week abortion ban into law, similarly to when we did it. It's supposed to take effect in September unless it's challenged, which organizations on the ground in Texas have been promised that they would do. But it is a unique bill. It had something that I hadn't seen before in this conversation about heartbeat bills, 6-week abortion bans. We try very hard to not use the phrase heartbeat bill. It has a twist that instead of having the government enforce the law, the bill turns the reins over to private citizens who are newly empowered to sue abortion providers or anyone who helps someone get an abortion. So that could be an abortion fund or any sort of like adjacent organization. And the person would not have to be connected to someone who has had an abortion or a provider to sue. So I am, again, not a lawyer. I don't know what that would look like in practice. It's also really hard to sometimes conceptualize what these bills look like in the way that they were written if they are not in effect, because sometimes they write them vaguer on purpose so that they are challenged, if that makes sense. The proponents of this new law hope to get around the legal challenges that have tied up abortion restrictions in the courts. Since no particular state official is enforcing said law, there's no one to sue from the government side. So like clinics, to my understanding, would have to wait for somebody to sue them. It seems very complicated. And we are seeing bills that have these new twists and turns pop up all over the country because there is a very, very, very well-funded, stronghold of the other side and their beliefs, and they fight very hard too. So we're seeing a lot of that type of thing happen. If anybody else did more research into the Texas bill and would like to share something in the chat or would like to talk about it when I pause, you're more than welcome to do that. I didn't want to not address it because Karen asked me to, but I will be honest in that I'm not familiar with some more of the logistical details of the bill. Okay, a more positive part of the conversation. What can you do as a person who heard all of this and is probably really frustrated? There's a lot of different ways to get involved in this work. Number one is sign up. There are a lot of organizations in Ohio that are doing this work. Planned Parenthood, NARAL, Women Have Options, which is the state's abortion fund, URGE, Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, NCJW, the National Coalition of Jewish Women. There are a lot of people that are doing repro and repro adjacent work in Ohio. Please tie in with them if you are not already. Get on their email lists, get on their volunteer lists if there's something that you're comfortable with that you want to do from home. And NARAL specifically is about to embark on a really big listening tour. So please be on the lookout for Cuyahoga County when we launch that date, or if you're in a surrounding county, we're also doing Summit and Portage and Lorraine, I believe. I don't think we're quite going over to Lake and Geauga, but it is basically going to be just a big open conversation with community members to find out a little bit more about what people want to see happen in Ohio so that we can focus on that work for the 2022 elections. Donate. There is absolutely, I can't stress enough how important it is to put dollars in the hands of the people that are doing this work. And I will also be very honest that, you know, NARAL and Planned Parenthood and bigger organizations like that need that money, but so do smaller organizations. So do your local abortion funds. So do organizations that are doing more specialized work. They are helping people really get tangible access to the things that they need. And so I encourage you to explore. And if you're looking for suggestions of places that cater to something specifically that you care about, please feel free to reach out and I can do the best that I can to connect you. Educate your own friends and family. Work to help them understand, correct their messaging and language, point them in the direction of resources. It is so important that we, as people that care about this cause, are not doubling down on stigmatizing language. So we're not saying heartbeat bill when we mean a 6-week abortion ban. We're not saying late term abortion when we mean abortions that happen later in pregnancy. Because when we use those terms, we're doubling down on the stigmatizing language that the anti-choice right developed the rhetoric for. So correct your friends and family's messaging, but also correct your own messaging and make sure that you're using language that's inclusive of the movement. If anybody is at all interested in clinic escorting, I coordinate the clinic escort program for Cleveland. I love it. It is one of my favorite things that I do. I do it separate from NARAL. It is just a volunteer thing that I've been part of for a long time. It is essentially helping facilitate patients get into the facility past the protesters. We have a whole training program in place. So if you think that you can, you know, stick it out in front of the protesters and have that thick skin to handle some of the stuff that they yell at you, and you have some free time and you'd like to do that, you can certainly connect with me and I can get you hooked up to that process. Call your representatives. Like I said earlier, when we're talking about sex education, there are a lot of people that represent us that are just not going to budge on certain things. We know that, and we can vote them out. But there is some wiggle room in the middle for some of these bipartisan issues that, you know, people on the other side of the aisle do care about in one sense or another. So call your people and talk to them and educate them on some of the things that you learned today or that you learn in other spaces. But even more important than that, with calling your representatives, participate in the upcoming redistricting process. This is so important. Ohio is home to some of the most egregiously gerrymandered districts in the entire country. Every 10 years, Ohio draws new district maps. Ohio voters over the last couple of years have approved new processes to prevent gerrymandering. A number of different things in place. And so there is an incredible organization called All on the Line Ohio. I'm sure they would love to come speak to you. All on the Line Ohio they are working entirely on the Ohio redistricting process. And they're great and they're so much more knowledgeable than I am on that. So the redistricting process and drawing of new districts and drawing of those new lines are the way to make sure that we are avoiding these like completely ridiculous districts with Republican strongholds that don't change. And that's it. That is all I have. Please get involved with us if you're so interested in doing so. Please follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, if you're on any of those social media websites. On YouTube, we post all of the Senate hearings, and the House hearings, all of the testimony that we do. That's all on our YouTube page, so you can see what the legislators are saying. You can see how we're messaging things. And everybody can feel free to email me at any given time, and I can help with whatever you need help with. So there are a couple of different questions in the chat. Let me take a look. So somebody says, why are the anti-abortion organizations not referred to as anti-choice organizations? That seems like a more accurate description, especially when compared to the term of pro-choice. This seems like a better narrative to me. So for a long time, these organizations were referred to as anti-choice. These bills were referred to as anti-choice, but my answer to that is one of the reasons why I don't just call myself pro-choice. I also call myself pro-abortion, and I am pro-abortion in the same way that I am pro-childcare and pro-adoption and pro-access to the things that people in the community are looking for. And so when we were talking about these anti-abortion restrictions, we wanted to be really clear that we're not hiding behind the world of reproductive rights, which has done amazing work over the years, but we want to be really specific in what we're fighting for. These bills are anti-choice, but they're not just anti-choice, they are anti-abortion, which is a right that people should have and is an essential part of reproductive health care. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we narrate things like that, I think, rather than, anti-choice. That's the same reason why, sometimes legislators will say, I'm here for a woman's choice, or I'm here for reproductive rights. And you have abortion rights organizations being like, please say the word abortion, because if you don't, people are going to be scared too. And so that's why we try to be a little bit more specific in that language. I hope that's helpful. Spike, you also asked, are there good YouTube channels for sex education? Yes, there are a ton of really awesome YouTube resources and like other programs that do sex education. I can send Karen a list. I have a list that I can send. And I can also connect folks with some other people that focus more specifically on sex education than I do. The Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio sex education program is amazing. One of my former interns is one of the educators there. They run an incredible program and do really good work. So yes, to your answer, those resources absolutely exist. Spike, you also said, can you protest outside the fake clinics and fake patients to waste their time? So we have done work around exposing fake clinics before in a number of different ways. We've also had people that have protested outside the fake clinics, but in my personal opinion, the same reason why we don't counter protest outside the abortion clinics is that there are still patients going into that facility, and they are patients that are trying to receive care. And so we want to reach those people, but we also don't want to create an environment for them that feels worse than what it is that they're already going into. And so I don't know if that really makes a lot of sense, but we haven't had a lot of luck and positive reactions and things like that when we do campaigns outside of a clinic, because our number one concern is always the patient. And we don't want them to be put in a situation where they feel uncomfortable. But there are a lot of other, if you go to exposefakeclinics.org, it's a website, exposefakeclinics.org. They talk even more in depth about crisis pregnancy centers and all of the ways that people all over the country are helping to expose what they really are. So that's like leaving Google reviews on Google, like actually reviewing the business and having people call and ask them questions and things like that. We definitely participate in those types of things and encourage when other people do. Greg said, I'm appalled at the provision in the Texas law that allows private citizens to sue anyone who helps a woman obtain an abortion. Do you know if this would apply to Texans taking women out of state for an abortion? I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know that piece of legislation that in depth. What I will say is that the articles that I read on it said that the person that is suing for this law doesn't even have to be a Texan. Like, there's no definition as to who can sue these organizations. So I would say maybe, but that's not something I know for sure. Spike asked, how does pro-choice affect suburban women voters and the midterms? Could you maybe specify your question a little bit more? I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I know the suburban women vote was important in the last election. So how does like this issue of pro-abortion rights affect voting, I guess, and how will that affect I guess not just midterms, but presidential elections or state elections, whatever, those elections?
Yeah. So statistically, abortion and pro-choice like values have been a winning issue for years. 7 out of 10 Americans, after time and time and time again of polling, supports access in some capacity to abortion care. And so the interesting thing about the suburban voters, and also like I don't really want to speak for, people that I don't work with that often. We do work with suburban voters, but there are also other organizations that target those suburban voters a little bit differently. I would say that a lot of them are often like in the middle, and that's where those education pieces come into play. And that's why we, encourage people to say pro-abortion and not just pro-choice and those types of things. So the pro-choice vote affects a lot of people. I can't really give you like statistics really, but I can say the 7 out of 10, which is held pretty strongly across the board since Roe v. Wade passed, is that over a broad kind of spectrum, abortion rights and access to reproductive rights are something that the general public is favorable to. Enid said, how will the young women who go to fake clinics find out about their options? Who goes to fake clinics? So who goes to fake clinics is a lot of people. What's really hard to kind of explain about CPCs is that they try to market their services in the same way that abortion clinics do. They put their clinics next to abortion clinics. They put billboards for their clinics outside of abortion clinics. All we can kind of do is try to mirror and expand over that marketing. We need to put up our own billboards. We need to be in all of these spaces where young folks are, that we're telling them about their options and being really, really vocal about where the clinics are, that the clinics are open, that these bills are not in effect. That's a lot of the work that I do as an organizer, is helping to make sure that people know what's actually happening in Ohio and what's not, because these people are very predatory. And that's where like exposed fake clinics and things like that come into play. But it's frustrating. CPCs are very frustrating to me, and they purposefully kind of prey on on low income areas, on housing projects, on places where they know that people that are going to need extra support are and would be looking for, free services or something like that. And that is, we have to also be in those spaces, is my best answer to that question. Greg, I apologize. I didn't see that you had this question above. So you've heard of people being arrested for ordering abortion drugs online. How common is it for women to order such drugs online? So there's a large conversation happening in this spectrum of reproductive care right now around self-managed abortion, and it is people learning how to and understanding and have access and gaining access to what they need to manage their own abortions safely at home in a supportive environment that they trust. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of legality issues around self-managed abortion and ordering drugs online and those types of conversations. I can certainly point you in the direction of organizations that do that work more specifically, but I will say that making abortion illegal will 100% not stop abortions. People, if they do not want to be pregnant, are going to find ways to not be pregnant. So that's my answer to that.
Okay, thank you. That was really fascinating, Hannah. Thank you so much. I just want to think, do you ever get frustrated? It's such an anti-abortion legislature and they keep passing more and more restrictions. And I'm just wondering if how you maintain your enthusiasm, in your commitment to this.
It's hard. I'm not going to pretend that it's not, or that I'm, happy to engage in this work all the time, because it's hard. But I know that this is going to sound extremely cliche, but it's not, in that doing things like this helps me to maintain that hope, because I want people to ask me questions. Spike, I want you to understand why, and not to point you out, but because you asked that question, I want you to understand why it's important to have that specificity in that language. And that makes me feel hopeful that we are changing people's minds and hearts, or maybe not even changing them, but encouraging them to think in a different way, or to, apply their values to this issue in new and different ways. And so, yeah, it's hard and it really sucks sometimes, but there's also a lot of really good, incredible, smart people doing this work. And I am very proud to work beside them. And that's very motivating for me.
And if I could ask one more question, do you think that, there was the Jane Network in the days before abortion. Do you think that will reappear if Roe versus Wade is overturned? There'll be a network again getting into states where?
Those things already exist.
The abortion funds. You mean like the abortion funds?
Yeah. So WHO is Women Have Options. It's our statewide abortion fund. We have 3 abortion funds in Ohio. WHO, which is the statewide fund, the Aggie Fund, which is in Toledo, and Preterm in Cleveland has their own fund. And all of the money that is donated to these funds are specifically towards people getting access to abortion care.
Whether in another state or anywhere.
Right. Mm-hmm. And these coalitions exist. They exist outside of Ohio. These networks of people have existed for a very long time. And so, if you're someone that's interested in transporting a patient or something like that, I really. You to tie in with organizations that are doing that work rather than like reinventing the wheel, because the Jane Network and things like that have never stopped. They've just changed and repurposed like their services and things like that.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else have a question for Hannah?
I hope I was able to answer everything in a way that,
Yeah, absolutely. Very thorough. It was really interesting and a very, very timely and important topic. So thank you so much for.
Of course. I'm so happy to have done this. It means a lot to me. I am Jewish myself, and it was very nice to be at a Shabbat, like I mentioned earlier. If anybody has any questions, you can please feel free to email Karen, and Karen can give you my email. But I will also send those sex education resources so you can send them out.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. We're all better informed now tonight.
Thanks, Anna. It was a great talk.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Bye-bye.